Okay, great. Well, hello again and welcome again, everyone, to today's school board trustee call on polluting education, co-hosted by Climate Caucus and the Center for Civic Governance. In case we're new to anybody here, Climate Caucus is a nonpartisan national network of over 1,000 locally elected leaders, including school trustees, counselors, mayors, and we offer resources, expert guidance, and a space to connect with fellow local leaders to support your local climate policy work. And the Center for Civic Governance is an independent policy think tank with a mission to foster and support local leadership for inclusive, equitable, and sustainable communities across Canada. So my name is Olivia. I'm the network manager at Climate Caucus, and I'm joining you all today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people, also known as Barrie, Ontario. And please feel free to also introduce yourselves in the chat if you like. You can share your name and location, your school district, just so we kind of know who's in the room today. So today we're joined by Anne Curie from the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, also known as CAPE. So Anne's going to be sharing findings from that recent report, Polluting Education, the Influence of Fossil Fuels on Children's Education in Canada, which reveals how oil and gas companies have influenced education across the country. So today we're going to be exploring the scope of the issue, what steps school board trustees can take, and then afterwards we'll have some time for Q&A. And just so everyone knows, I'm going to be recording the presentation part of this call, but then I'll stop recording for the discussion and Q&A. And so with that, now I'd like to introduce Anne Curie. Anne is an independent scholar and climate advocate based in Toronto who believes that advancing climate education is a key climate solution. She serves on the board of Environmental Education Ontario, co-chairs the Toronto Climate Action Network, and is an active member of For Our Kids Toronto. Anne formerly served as community co-chair of the Toronto District School Board's Environmental Sustainability Community Advisory Committee, and now works with CAPE as the regional coordinator for Ontario and Manitoba. So thanks so much, Anne, for being here today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and really nice to be here and to meet everyone, and really looking forward to our conversation. So I will share my screen and we will get going. Okay, I will move into slideshow mode. Hopefully you can all see that. Thumbs up?
Yeah.
Yes, amazing. Okay. Well, thank you again for having me at Climate Caucus. So I will be presenting today on this report on the influence of the fossil fuel industry in our education systems and schools across Canada. I thought I'd begin by just explaining a little bit about my own pathway into this work. So I'm originally from Australia, which you may tell from my accent. I'm of Irish, Scottish, and English ancestry. I'm a settler on lands in Australia, and also here in where I now live in Toronto on the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe Confederacies, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Huron-Wendat. I have a PhD in history. I studied in the United States. I came to Toronto in early 2000s and made this my home. And this is where I've raised my two kids. I've always been concerned about environment and climate change issues, but it was really the release of the 2018 IPCC report, which some of you may remember, which really sounded the alarm on the climate crisis and how little time we had to really address this in order to avoid the worst outcomes. And certainly having two children really strengthened my resolve. So I joined For Our Kids, which is a nationwide network of parents and caregivers advocating on climate justice. I also joined the Toronto District School Board's Environmental Sustainability Community Advisory Committee and have been there supporting the actually really great work that the Toronto District School Board has been doing around climate. Unfortunately, that advisory committee right now has been suspended with the provincial takeover of the school boards, 4 school boards here in Ontario. So that has been very disappointing to see. I am, in addition, working with Toronto Climate Action Network, which is a network of over 70 groups across Toronto, So doing all sorts of good work advocating for municipal climate action and supporting other um, campaigns as well, both at the provincial and federal level. I'm on Environmental Education Ontario. We have a campaign there around climate change education. And I'm now employed by CAPE, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And it was CAPE and For Our Kids who commissioned this report that I will now discuss. And that was the pathway that led me to CAPE, where I'm now employed. Okay. My computer is not moving. Ah, there we go. So, um, So I just wanted to first outline the problem, then we'll get into the context that we're in right now, and then we'll move into the report looking at the extent of fossil fuel industry involvement, the forms that involvement takes, and the effects of fossil fuel involvement in our education system. And then lastly, I have a few thoughts in particular about how school trustees in your position might address this. So I guess the big finding is that the fossil fuel industry is absolutely in our schools. And I knew this, but even I was surprised at how extensive it is. And I'll come back to this, but it was really kind of shocking to learn there are at least 39 oil and gas companies, all of the big ones and many small ones, 10 industry-related companies, including utilities, and then two industry lobbying associations, the big ones, Pathways Alliance and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. So they are very extensively involved, and I will get into how they're involved later on in the presentation, but they're there. So why is this a problem? The fossil fuel industry is in our schools because it serves their interests, their business interests in promoting their brand and maintaining our dependence on their products. They're doing this for their interests. The fossil fuel industry does not serve our students' interests. The continued burning of fossil fuels is harming young people's health now, and it's fueling the climate crisis that threatens their future. Schools, as you know, should be public places for learning, including learning about climate change, which is critical education now. And fossil fuel industry influence, as we will see, is undermining that education. We ban other harmful products like tobacco from schools. We need to ban fossil fuels from our school system. So that's it. I could end here, but I won't. Now I'm going to get into more detail. So, there have been a few reports recently on there've been extensive research on the harms of fossil fuels on our health, but a couple of recent reports, the Global Climate Health Alliance report from Cradle to Grave came out a few weeks ago, which really extensively documented from cradle to grave how fossil fuels are impacting our health at all stages of life, from fetal development to old age, at every stage of fossil fuel production, from production, transmission, and consumption, and then all of the different toxins that are harming all parts of our bodies. Children are particularly vulnerable because of their developing bodies to the harms of air pollution, to toxins released by fossil fuel combustion. This is affecting their health, their brains, their respiratory systems, their cardiac systems. Asthma is becoming a huge problem, particularly in polluted cities. There are now, I believe, over 900,000 children affected by asthma. So this is also contributing to absenteeism from school and affecting their learning. And it's at the sites of production of fossil fuels, there are growing rates of cancer. So pediatricians are reporting previously unseen cancers in children so young at sites of fracking. So this report is really quite confronting and very well informed by global research. And fossil fuel air pollution is a really significant issue for all of our health. It's contributing right now at over 17,000 premature deaths a year. So fossil fuels are a problem right now for our health, and they are a problem for our kids' future. So the burning of fossil fuels is the primary driver of the global climate crisis. 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels. 90% of all CO2 emissions comes from the burning of fossil fuels. And a point to note here is that since 1988, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from 100 companies. And this includes the top fossil fuel companies. So BP, Chevron, Exxon, they are huge polluters of the emissions that are driving this crisis. 2024, the hottest year on record, and we're seeing the impacts globally with the wildfires and massive flooding and increasing food insecurity. So the climate crisis is a health crisis. Delaying the transition off fossil fuels is costing lives and health now, and climate change action is a lifeline. We're seeing heat-related deaths surging. We're seeing more and more people experiencing food insecurity, and we're seeing more and more people impacted and dying from wildfire smoke as our forests dry out and as these wildfires become more intense as a result of fossil fuel-driven climate change. And young people are also feeling this impact, and it's affecting their mental health. You may have seen this report on how the mental health impacts of climate change on young people, with 78% reporting that climate change is impacting their overall mental health, 69% feeling abandoned by the government on climate change. But interestingly and critically, young people do think and see climate change education as really important for addressing the climate crisis. So 60% of them believe that the education system should be doing more to address climate change and teach them about climate change. And really encouragingly, 71% believe that together we can do something to affect change. So that is encouraging, and it really shows us that schools can play an important role in addressing this climate crisis, and students want to be part of that. So Canada has committed to action. We did sign the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was to limit warming to 2 degrees and to pursue all efforts to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. We did declare a climate emergency. And in 2021, we passed the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which set a 2030 target of reducing emissions by 40 to 45% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. So how is Canada doing? I thought this is a pop-up quiz. Um, so I wanted to ask, where do you think Canada ranks among G7 countries in reducing its emissions? So anyone think Canada, if we've got Japan, Germany, Canada, the US, the UK, Italy, and France, anyone think Canada might be #1 for reducing emissions? Not seeing any hands. #2, not seeing any hands. #3, #4, #5. I don't know if I can see all the hands, so perhaps some of you may be putting up hands. #6, #7. Okay, well, we are not doing great. Canada is actually the worst for reducing our emissions. We are so not on track. The really sad news, the really concerning news, is that Canada has never met a target that it has set itself. Perhaps the surprising news here is that it is actually the UK which is doing the best at reducing its emissions. So, and there's been really significant progress in other European EU countries as well. So other countries are in fact joining the transition off fossil fuels. So the UK closed its last coal-fired power plant last year, which is hugely significant. Like the UK is they started the Industrial Revolution. Coal is central to there has been central to their economy, and they closed the last power plant. They are really ramping up renewables. Renewables are now producing more energy than coal. Solar is so much cheaper than coal. And I want to highlight California, which is really doing a lot, powering up its economy on renewable energy and really moving off methane, natural, so-called natural gas. So that's huge. Worth mentioning as someone from Ontario that Ontario until 2016 had been in a cap and trade agreement with the state of California. The Doug Ford came to power and cancelled that cap and trade agreement, cancelled 750 renewable energy projects, and has set us on a path toward more gas-fired power plants and nuclear, while California has gone in the opposite direction. So we know that the transition is possible. We know it's underway. Young people want our governments to be doing more. Why aren't they? One of the answers to this question is the direct influence of the fossil fuel industry in lobbying. The fossil fuel industry in Canada lobbies intensively at the federal level and also at the provincial government level. Environmental Defence does a regular report on the lobbying of the fossil fuel industry, and you can see here this graph of all of the different major companies and their lobbying at the federal level for 2024, with Enbridge leading the way with 106 lobby meetings in 2024. So fossil fuel industry representatives are lobbying our MPs more than 4 times per working day. So that direct influence is huge, and they are lobbying against climate policy and for more fossil fuel subsidies and more fossil fuel infrastructure. And they are also using indirect influence. So no doubt you've all seen the advertising and the greenwashing of the fossil fuel industry. They are buying community consent by sponsoring all sorts of projects and initiatives in communities and cities across Canada. They're funding think tanks and experts to support their positions on energy and climate policy. They sow doubt about renewable energies. They promote astroturf front groups like Canada Energy Citizens, so-called, which advocates for more oil and gas. And they're influencing education as well. Now, there is a history to this too. So these tactics of the fossil fuel industry have definitely expanded, I would say, especially in the last 3 decades. But there is also a long history of oil and gas involvement in our schools. So in fact, they've been in our schools since the 1920s, building brand loyalty through branded maps, for instance, like this beautiful Imperial Oil branded map of Canada, providing educational toolkits to teachers, and sponsoring films. Shell, for instance, has had this educational film series that they provided to schools. And many of those films were quite good, but they always came with that Shell brand, promoting Shell, building brand loyalty. Then in the 1990s, fossil fuel influence and interest in education took another turn. So beyond building brand loyalty, they really wanted to get in and shape public understanding of climate change, as that understanding of climate change was itself growing and the public was becoming more and more concerned. And the fossil fuel industry itself knew about climate change. I don't know how many people on this call are familiar with the phrase Exxon knew, because Exxon knew about climate change, Shell knew, Chevron knew, they all knew. They employed their own scientific teams in the 1970s and 1980s to study climate change, to study the impacts of the continued burning of fossil fuels on our atmosphere, on our ecosystems, on our societies. And I have to say, reading this report of their own research and the reports that were going to CEOs while I was doing this report, was really, it kind of shook me when you have a scientist telling Shell's CEO that the continued burning of fossil fuels will threaten global habitability. So they knew. And they did not respond by sharing that information with the public. Quite the contrary, they responded by campaigns to sow doubt. So in 1988, Dr. James Hansen testified to Congress about the dangers of global warming. That generated a lot of public concern. And in 1989, the following year, when it becomes clear that there's a push to regulate the oil and gas industry more to reduce the impacts of climate change, they get together, they establish this global climate coalition to obstruct government action. 1997, the Kyoto Protocol is adopted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in 1988, the coalition drafts an action plan for global science communications, and education is a target from the start. So if you ever go into that global climate science dossiers, you will find this memo. And the memo is sort of outlines a plan for how they are going to address growing public knowledge about climate change and their plan for sowing doubt. So they are very clear that victory will be achieved when average citizens understand, recognize uncertainties in climate science, and recognition of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom. And they're very clear from the outset that they're going to do outreach to educators as part of this plan to sow doubt about the science of climate change. So they're going to reach out to the National Science Teachers Association. They want to distribute educational materials directly to schools. So this is happening in the US, and it has consequences for Canada as well. I have a section in the report which looks at how this transfers to the Canadian context. But many of the companies in Canada, of course, global companies that are also connected to the US. So the same strategies are being used here as well. More recently, it is worth noting that the industry has shifted from a strategy of doubt to delay by greenwashing themselves as part of the solution and aggressively promoting themselves as necessary to modern life. So that is also part of their messaging. Okay, let's get into the report. So again, we'll go into the extent of fossil fuel involvement, the context in which this is occurring, the forms of involvement, sponsorship, government partnerships, and the funding of third-party education providers, the problem of petropedagogy as part of that. So I already outlined how extensive their involvement is. As I mentioned, 39 oil and gas companies, 10 industry-related companies, and these 2 lobbying associations. We have a database of all of this involvement. So this is just a snapshot because we know that this is constantly changing and that new initiatives are, in fact, I just learned about another one just the other day from Fortis, Alberta, and its involvement in education. But a snapshot here of Enbridge and what it's involved in. So if you go into the database, you can see that they're funding local school-based programs with, programs about filling backpacks and building playgrounds, school library programs, grants for environmental organizations. They sadly fund Earth Rangers, and I want to say Earth Rangers does a lot of good work, and I so wish they weren't funded by Enbridge. So I don't, part of this report, I want to be sensitive to the fact that a lot of these third-party providers do some really good work, but as we'll see a little farther along, sometimes that work is limited by the fossil fuel industries that fund them. Anyway, just noting here that in this case, Earth Rangers does receive funding from Enbridge. Enbridge also funds Let's Talk Science, and they have other programs they fund in Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. So it's extensive involvement across different provinces and across different programs. And in the case of Enbridge, that involvement, let's just be honest, is buying the goodwill of communities across Canada and certainly communities across Ontario, where Enbridge has a monopoly on our gas work. So all of that funding of local school programs is buying community goodwill. And Enbridge is most certainly profiting from that goodwill and reducing any resistance to the expansion of its gas network across Ontario. Enbridge stands to make $1.3 billion from Ontario ratepayers. So they are doing very, very well. What's the context in which this is occurring? So the context is really a lack of government funding, as you, I'm sure, are all very well aware, and particularly a lack of government leadership on environment and climate change education. So a 2021 LSF study showed that only 6 of 13 provinces and territories have documents or education policy with a focus on climate change and sustainability. And as part of that too, it's worth noting that when climate change does appear in curriculums in different provinces, it's usually as an elective rather than a mandatory course. So that also reduces the number of students who will ever have any climate change education as they go through their school life. 2020, and this is what is documented in this 2023 study as well by Ellen Field, who's a prominent climate change education scholar based here at Lakehead University. So this lack of government leadership and insufficient funding has created this opportunity for the fossil fuel industry to insert itself and exert its influence in our schools and in climate and environmental education in particular. Because this is not mandatory, because climate change education is not getting the public funds that it should be getting, teachers rely on resources from third-party providers, and this is where, unfortunately, we're seeing many of these third-party providers are reliant on fossil fuel funding, and that can shape the kinds of messages that come through in these resources, as we'll see shortly. So, fossil fuel industry strategies. They are doing the direct sponsoring of school activities and providing branded educational materials to schools directly, establishing government partnerships with government to develop curricula and resources, and then again, indirectly sponsoring third-party providers. So these are some examples of the direct fossil fuel sponsorships of school and education programs across Canada. So we love science fairs. I want my kids to go to science fairs and participate. I kind of don't want them to be sponsored by TransCanada and Sask Energy and all of these ways in which these companies then get to associate their brand with, the innovation and creativity and science education with our kids. In BC, Chevron had this Fuel Your School program where if you fueled up at a local service station, a portion of the money would go to schools. So they're really tying their brand to schooling and good things and education. Synovus has been doing these food forests. Again, the people who are doing the food forests, great, great work. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to get our kids out in nature. I just wish it were not sponsored by Synovus Energy. And then this was actually the case of Fortis BC was in fact actually the example which led to this report on fossil fuel industry influence in education, because it was a Cape BC doctor and parent who saw in her kid's backpack school materials branded by Fortis BC. And she was thinking, like, why is my kid bringing home educational materials from a gas company in his backpack? And some of these materials were really quite questionable. So the example here was a grade 5 lesson about the rock cycle, which did not actually discuss geology, but instead showed at what depth natural gas is drilled, and benignly mentioned that methane is pumped out of the ground and made no mention of the highly destructive process of hydraulic fracturing or fracking, nor the health harms to communities where who live nearby fracking sites. Fossil fuel companies and government partnerships. So in 2024, Saskatchewan partnered with Tyne Energy to develop a new high school course on oil and gas. And in Alberta, perhaps no surprise, we have seen Alberta government, a report came out that they had been working with TC Energy and natural kind of natural to develop oil and gas studies, and their curriculum framework does require teachers to teach about the economic benefits of the oil and gas industry. So that is happening in Alberta and Saskatchewan. I would say keep your eye on Ontario's curriculum as well. A recent an article in the Hamilton Spectator came out recently where a grade 9 geography teacher noticed that the new grade 9 Ontario curriculum, he noticed some changes. And one of the changes there was that items that had previously been in the curriculum had been removed. So topics such as the green belt had been removed from the grade 9 curriculum. And then I would say even more concerningly, the mercury poisoning experienced by Grassy Narrows First Nation had also been removed from the curriculum in Ontario. So keep your eye on what's happening in Ontario if any of you folk are from Ontario. And then we have this fossil fuel funding of third-party providers. And there's a range here. So there are organizations that were founded and funded by industry, which quite frankly are in many respects industry front groups. There are organizations that are industry funded but have fossil fuel industry representatives on their boards. So that includes 10 Peaks and Let's Talk Science. And then organizations that just receive fossil fuel money but don't have representatives on their boards. I just wanted to throw this quote in here because it really shows how the fossil fuel industry was looking at the opportunity to fund third-party providers and what it meant for them. So this was from a 1989 advertising feature for Seeds, which is now Seeds Connection. And it was basically to the oil and gas industry, like, you should be funding education because this is an opportunity to get your viewpoints into the education system. And so this is the message here. The problem with the energy industry in general has with going directly into education is that any material it produces is immediately suspect. It may, sorry, I've got to move, may at worst be branded as propaganda. At best, teachers will look at it with suspicion and wonder what the catch is. One solution is to fund someone else, someone recognized as a reliable authority in the field of education. It was out of this concept that the Seeds Foundation was born. So they, very clear about what their interests were there. Okay. So what are the impacts of this? Petropedagogy. Emily Eaton and Nick Day are two scholars who coined the term petropedagogy. And the basic gist of it is that what they're seeing with fossil fuel funded educational third-party providers is a focus on individual actions that insulate the fossil fuel industries from criticism and dissuade young people from questioning or understanding the role of corporate power in the climate crisis. And alongside that, a restricting of the imagination of possible climate solutions, restricting it to individual acts of conservation that fail to challenge the structural growth of fossil fuel production and consumption. So we certainly found this as we were looking at resources from third-party providers. And I think we were struck both by what was in the messaging in a lot of these resources and what was not in the messaging. So educational resources funded by industry tend to obscure or limit references to the role of the fossil fuel industry itself in driving climate change, tend to limit or obscure references to the impacts of fossil fuel-driven climate change on societies and ecosystems, and issues of global climate injustice. The fact that those most impacted by climate change are disproportionately those already impacted by other structural inequities and those who have done the least to cause climate change themselves. So issues of global climate injustice, both here in Canada and globally, are typically not addressed in industry-funded resources. They often don't mention the need to transition off fossil fuels to secure a climate-safe future, with two notable exceptions. It is referenced in relay education and green learning, and they don't reference the urgency of this transition. The need, well, to be frank, we are probably past the point now of limiting warming to 1.5, but the urgent need to transition away from fossil fuels is absolutely remains, and every fraction of degree that we avoid will save lives. So it remains a very urgent problem. What we did see was individual actions, greenwashing, so-called red washing, bias-balanced approach, and techno-optimism. So the reduce your carbon footprint. How many folks here are aware of where this idea for reducing your carbon footprint came from? Anyone want to throw anything in the chat? Or it came from BP. Was devised by a PR company employed by BP, and the whole idea of this attention to what's your carbon footprint is to shift the blame to consumers and away from the corporation itself. And it was an extremely successful advertising strategy. And so that whole idea of reducing our own carbon footprint is widespread, and it is most definitely something that we saw come up again and again in educational materials sponsored, funded by the industry. So that's sort of standard. That one was across the board. We saw greenwashing. So both greenwashing of the fossil fuel industry itself, and this example is from Inside Education, with the greenwashing of so-called natural gas as a cleaner burning fuel compared to coal and oil. And that is true. So-called natural gas is cleaner burning compared to coal and oil. But when you factor in the methane emissions from leaks in the production and transmission process, it is in fact as bad as coal, because methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. And natural gas by no means is something that we should consider as a green sort of form of energy. And the other kind of greenwashing we saw was greenwashing by association. So here you see Fortis Alberta and Enbridge sponsoring this wind turbine project with earth rangers, suggesting, of course, that Fortis and Enbridge are supporting wind power, and they are, but it's a tiny, tiny, minuscule percentage of the kinds of energy they're actually producing. So this sort of greenwashing by association. So-called red washing. So this is a term that has been coined by Indigenous scholars. Here, Clayton Thomas Mueller, who's from Cree, Matthias Kolom Cree Nation, describes red washing as an attempt by a corporation to paint itself as benevolent, the process of covering up the detrimental effects of corporate initiatives with friendly slogans and lump sum donations to Indigenous communities. I'm not Indigenous, clearly, and so cannot speak to the experiences of Indigenous communities who might well want to take advantage of monies from corporations, but I would note that this is very much how the fossil fuel industry wants to present its relationship with First Nations and Indigenous communities. What they don't want young people talking about is so much as about Indigenous resistance to fossil fuel infrastructure and fossil fuel projects. But the biased balance approach. So that approach we saw in across a few different third-party providers. This one from Inside Education. So the biased balance thing works by including industry perspectives in lessons and presenting that as bias balanced, with the implication that lesson plans that don't include industry perspectives are therefore biased. So the biased balanced lessons will, like, this one, for instance, the oil sands field trip. Teachers can go to this and learn about this program that proposes, quote, concerns and solutions to oil sands production, striking a balance between energy and environmental needs. And they will include industry perspectives. What they will not include is references to the fossil fuel driven climate crisis that is also part of this picture. So they will shift the frame to a much more narrow frame and leave out climate change from the lesson plans that they are presenting to students. And then we also see this prioritization of technological change over systemic change. So techno-optimism, the idea that technology alone will solve the problem. And we're seeing this broadly with carbon capture and storage, which is hugely expensive and unproven at scale, and basically serves the interests of the fossil fuel industry in continuing production. So here is an example of a lesson from Let's Talk Science on carbon capture and storage. And this we also saw promoted in a number of the other organizations that receive funding from the industry. Okay, so we need, I would argue, a fossil-free education which will serve a fossil-free future for our kids. The UN has identified climate change education as essential to building societal understanding of what it takes to shape a low emissions and equitable future. So climate change education is critical. Other countries are getting on board and doing a better job of this. And I was excited to see that Manitoba might be taking some action in this with its new roadmap to net zero. So I'm very interested to see what will be happening there. We had a number of recommendations for advocacy in our report, asking school board and provincial policies to ban fossil fuel sponsorships, to vet education resources that receive fossil fuel funding, and to advocate for publicly funded climate justice education and resources. But I was thinking that perhaps the easiest one to start with might be the ban on fossil fuel sponsorships, because there is momentum building on this one already. There are calls from the UN, calls from global health organizations to ban fossil fuel sponsorships, much as we have banned tobacco advertising in schools. So that is starting to happen. It is happening in countries and it's happening in municipalities around the globe. So The Hague has banned fossil fuel ads and recently won a court case which has allowed it to keep its ban on fossil fuel ads. New Zealand is implementing a regional fossil ad ban. Spain has introduced a national ban on fossil ads. And recently, last year in Toronto, we banned misleading fossil ads on the TTC and fossil fuel advocacy advertising on city-owned property as well. And the fossil ad ban campaign has started to reach schools too. So the big one was the banning of fossil fuel sponsorships in the Australian Capital Territory. The Australian Capital Territory is kind of like DC. It is where the capital of Australia, Canberra, is. And so there was a complete ban passed on fossil fuel sponsorships in schools throughout the ACT, which was great to see. This was supported by a parent group, Parents for Climate Action, and a group called Comms Declare. So Comms Declare Climate Emergency. And there, the founder was very clear. Schools around the country already ban sponsorships from companies we have deemed too dangerous for kids: tobacco, alcohol, weapons manufacturing, gambling. Fossil fuel companies deserve to be on this list. So there is momentum there. There is parent support for this. So I would encourage you to consider this one as you think about this issue of fossil fuel influence in our schools. And with that, I will thank you for your time and would love